Welcome to the Gestalt Get Together, presented by SpeechTherapyPD.com. Each episode has its own accompanying audio course on SpeechTherapyPD.com and is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. The Gestalt Get Together is your podcast for discussing the state of the evidence of Gestalt language processing, associated therapy modalities, and how our field is responding to the frameworks of GLP and NLA. I'm Corinne Zmoos, MS, CCC-SLP, a musical language therapist who's dedicated to celebrating while investigating Gestalt language processing, protecting the scientific method, and reducing cognitive linguistic biases about this framework and these clients that I love so much. My areas of focus are psychoacoustics, music theory, and musical syntax in GLPs. Previously, I worked closely with key players in the GLP quote-unquote movement, but experienced concerns with the propensity for logical fallacies and resistance to quantitative inquiry in the larger community. I now identify myself as lovingly skeptical, and I hope that listeners will sharpen their ability to recognize linguistic choices that move a cause forward without strong evidence, what level of evidence we're actually dealing with, and where we need to go next to support these kids that we care about. So what can you expect from us? Our episodes will provide balanced and educational interviews about clinician experiences, live coaching and problem solving about therapeutic decision making with a healthy dose of musical language recommendations thrown in, discussions on the logical fallacies and cognitive biases that emerge when implementing a new approach, and even some elements of the BITE model that have emerged within the larger GLP movement. Most importantly, this podcast is intended to help you embrace, investigate, and analyze your unique role in child development for Gestalt language processors without getting in your own way. This podcast is a celebration of neurodivergent learning, and we look forward to you learning with us along the way. Welcome to the Gestalt Get Together. This is your podcast for discussing the state of the evidence of Gestalt language processing, associated therapy modalities, and how our field is responding to the growing world of GLP discourse. This podcast recording is 1 hour, 30 minutes, and is offered for 0.15 ASHA CEUs. My name is Corinne Zmoos, MS CCC-SLP, and I aim to investigate psychoacoustics, music theory, and musical syntax in Gestalt language processors when it comes to my clinical focus. I want to make it so clear that I love Gestalt language processors and the framework of Gestalt language processing. I work with these kids every day, and I've had considerable success using the ideas from these proposed frameworks. But I also identify as lovingly skeptical because I want more information, data, and evidence to support the claims that we're making as clinicians who work with GLPs. My hope is that listeners of this podcast will sharpen their ability to recognize linguistic choices that can move the cause forward, to be able to advocate for stronger evidence, and balance the three sides of the EBP triangle. In this episode, we're going to be exploring some common logical fallacies that can emerge when we're making decisions about social media information about Gestalt language processors. Before we begin, just as I like to make it clear that I love GLPs, I also want to make it clear that I am guilty of so many logical fallacies. When I first started talking about GLP, and my techniques with musical language, particularly on social media, I look back at some of my earlier content and I feel sick to my stomach because it was rife with logical fallacies, speaking with so much certainty and making a lot of leaps in logic. That was part of the reason why I wanted to learn more about fallacies, to be able to better spot them in my own communication, not only with clients and their families and other professionals in the real world, but on a place like social media. Because as my following grew, I started to recognize, not only in my own content, but in other people's content, the propensity for ideas to spread really quickly, even without strong evidence behind it. And so I wanted to start teaching people about these fallacies so we can start to notice them in our own conversational patterns, the way we share evidence, but also to become more savvy in consuming social media information about this emerging framework of GLP. When it comes to this episode, I would love for you to be able to walk away being able to define what is a logical fallacy and how does this concept or this set of concepts pertain to our field as speech-language pathologists. I hope that you'll come away being able to contrast between a formal logical fallacy and an informal logical fallacy. I also hope that you'll come away being able to list and describe at least 3 of the most common logical fallacies. I'd also love for you to be able to identify or generate examples of each of these fallacies as it relates to social media information about Gestalt language processing. So what is a logical fallacy? These are techniques or choices that a communicator or someone on social media makes that weaken their claim. The weaknesses can emerge in this person's claim, whether that's on an Instagram post, in a comment, on a Facebook group, in a tweet. It's weakened because they employ perhaps a misapplied belief, maybe a misinformed idea about language acquisition, an inadequate argument about the network in the brain that is responsible for a certain emergence of a skill. Maybe their argument is illogical or even invalid. And then perhaps the fallacy is that they're using deception or persuasion-driven language rather than strong evidence. So why does it matter to start to recognize these in clinical information dissemination, particularly on social media? In terms of clinical and scientific information that's being shared through these modalities, we are the ones as consumers who have to do the difficult and challenging investigatory work that in reputable forms of media is typically done by editors and fact checkers, and those are full-time jobs. Learning how to identify fallacies could help you start to recognize and hopefully explain why someone's argument on a post, a comment, or somewhere else does not actually or fully prove their claim, and also how it might be trying to persuade you or mislead you. And persuasion is not always bad. Now, social media information, social media content is typically very brief, especially on sites like Instagram and Facebook, where brevity is really compelling. In these information sharing spaces, there's really sometimes little room, physical or temporally or based on our attention spans, and sometimes little tolerance for detailed argumentation. Now, when you combine the desire to help others, which I can assume most people listening have a desire to help others, alongside the thrill of getting followers, the thrill of other forms of reinforcement on social media, those who are communicating information about GLP, they may employ some argument constructs for their claims that are eye-catching, simple, lacking clear evidence, or without a strong thread of reasoning. You might think of a really beautiful, pretty, clean, and neat infographic that shares your claim very clearly to readers, but it doesn't have a lot of strong evidence behind it because that evidence might be a couple paragraphs long, and that doesn't fit on a carousel very neatly. Now, these choices that include fallacies are often made unintentionally or in good faith. I completely relate to that in my own social media communication. And it's something that I'm still growing in every single day. It's really, really hard to detach communication from these fallacies for a lot of people. And also in this presentation tonight, in episodes of this podcast, it is also rife. My communication is probably rife with fallacies as well. This is a skill to develop. Now, I believe that it's of critical importance to note that just because a communicator includes a logical fallacy, their original claim is not necessarily wrong. It also doesn't mean that someone's trying to deceive you, sell you something, or distract you from other viewpoints, especially opposing viewpoints. Including a logical fallacy can simply mean that a communicator on social media or down the hall or across the table from you just hasn't provided enough evidence for their claim, perhaps the best quality of evidence, or their biases are intruding on their ability to provide and interpret facts to support their argument. So there are two main forms of fallacies. We have formal and informal. What are formal fallacies? These are fallacies that are found when claims have an incorrect form to them or an incorrect structure of how the argument's being presented. They tend to have a very clear violation of certain rules of logic. I like to think about this category as like a container versus content. So think about like a plastic container you'd put your lunch in. A formal fallacy would be some sort of defect with the actual container itself, rather than faulty food inside of it. Though, think about if a container is not well made, the food inside of it might not be of the best quality either. So formal fallacy is more so faulty container rather than faulty contents. That's informal fallacy, faulty contents. So formal fallacy almost always features some sort of non sequitur. So that's a conclusion that someone makes that doesn't really have a connection to the claim or the argument itself. There isn't that clear connection between what is claimed and how it's backed up. So I want to look at two formal fallacies and how they may show up in social media discourse about Gestalt language processing. I want to note that these examples are inspired by real posts, but the comments are not exact quotes. And I know the irony of that I'm looking for evidence, but I'm not providing direct citations. Really where we are in this conversation, I didn't feel comfortable taking direct citations from communicators on social media because I wanted to present these arguments really in good faith and recognizing that a lot of people don't recognize their logical fallacies. So I provided interpretations of that. Now, that is completely up for criticism. And you may say, what a fallacious thing to do to not include direct quotes. But I don't want to come across as antagonistic to other members of the GLP community. Okay, so one formal fallacy is the masked man fallacy. This fallacy is a claim that is faulty because it rests upon a communicator's knowledge of something, their personal knowledge, and their personal knowledge may not rely upon the breadth of all the facts related to the claim. So let me give you the example that actually inspired the name of this fallacy. So premise one is, I don't know who Klaus is. Premise two, I do not know who the masked man is. Conclusion, therefore, Klaus is not the masked man. Take a moment and see if you can see the faulty logic in that. I'll say it once more. I know who Klaus is. I do not know who the masked man is. Therefore, Klaus is not the masked man. You might notice that Klaus might actually be the masked man. You may just not recognize him while he's wearing a mask. Now, here's an example related to Gestalt language processing. Premise one, I know who my autistic clients are. Premise two, I do not know who Gestalt language processors are. Conclusion, therefore, my autistic clients are not Gestalt language processors. I'm going to say it one more time. I want to see if you can try and find where faulty form logic might be. I know who my autistic clients are. I do not know who Gestalt language processors are. Therefore, my autistic clients are not Gestalt language processors. So this argument, they claim that their knowledge of autism and their lack of knowledge about GLP, or perhaps the lack of good arguments they're drawing from for GLP itself externally, this means that their clients are not GLPs. Now, it does not provide a strong argument that these two, the diagnosis and then the identity or description, do not or could not overlap. There could, in fact, be an overlap, but This communicator is basing their claim on their own personal knowledge set. Perhaps if they were open to or interested in learning more about the GLP framework, they might recognize a lot of overlapping characteristics between their autistic clients and what a GLP is described as. Another formal fallacy is called affirming the consequent. I want to give an example of this fallacy that's pretty concrete when we affirm the consequent. If a person lives in Baltimore, then they live in Maryland. My aunt lives in Maryland. Therefore, my aunt lives in Baltimore. So I want you to see if you can notice where the form or the container is really faulty. It seems so obvious when it comes to a concrete example like this. I'll read it once more. If a person lives in Baltimore, then they live in Maryland. My aunt lives in Maryland. Therefore, my aunt lives in Baltimore. Now, here's an example that might be harder to spot on social media about GLP. If a child is a Gestalt language processor, then they produce echolalia. My client produces echolalia. Therefore, my client is a GLP. Now take a beat, see if anything comes to mind while I read it again. If a child is a Gestalt language processor, then they produce echolalia. My client produces echolalia, and therefore my client is a GLP. Now, though this claim may be true, and it may be applicable when we think about the GLP description or framework, this is discounting other populations that produce echolalia, including Tourette's, OCD, and ADHD. If the production of echolalia is only applying to Gestalt language processors, as this claimant might be referring to, we may be leaving out some important clinical analysis to get to the root of what this client may need, if they actually, in fact, do have Tourette's, OCD, or ADHD. So that's affirming the consequent. Now I want to talk about informal fallacies. Informal fallacies may have an acceptable form or structure in their claim, but the content within them is faulty, incomplete, misleading, or deceptive. This one, I want you to think about a solid container with faulty contents. So again, if we think about that container of food, the container itself is fine, but the food within it is something's up with it. So I want to take a look at several examples of informal fallacies that I encounter in social media communication. In my anecdotal experience and my interpretation of this phenomena that occurs in this type of communication, I tend to notice that informal fallacies are more common in GLP posts and comments. And once again, please note that these examples are inspired by real posts and comments, but are not exact quotes. And I recognize again that you may feel some sort of way about that. And I completely understand both sides. The first informal fallacy I want to talk about is the appeal to ignorance. The appeal to ignorance is found when a communicator claims that a lack of contrary evidence to their claim means that their claim is true, or that the lack of confirming evidence for someone else's claim means that it's false. So let me say that a little differently. So an appeal to ignorance. Someone posting on social media says, you know what? There's not any evidence that tells me what I'm saying is wrong. That must make it true. Or someone on the other side of the issue might say, there's no evidence that this is real. It has to be false. So let's take a look at both sides of those and an example that might capture each position on the appeal to ignorance. First, if a claim, approach to GLP, or technique to support GLPs is not yet proven to be completely false, not true, not helpful, an argument maker should not in good faith be able to conclude that that claim is absolutely true. So this is the next line. It's inspired by several claims and posts that I've seen. Gestalt language processing is real. No one has any research to prove that it isn't. And so this is saying that there's not any research to prove that GLP isn't real, so it must be true. GLP must be true. Now, on the other hand, if a claim about an approach, a technique, a framework has not yet been proven completely true, everything about it is real and true and evidence-based, an argument maker on the other side really shouldn't, in good faith, be able to conclude that the claim or idea is absolutely false. So someone else might say, everything in natural language acquisition is pseudoscience. There isn't any research to support it. Now, in discourse, the appeal to ignorance, whether that's saying that this must be completely false because it hasn't been proved totally true, or the opposite, this has to be completely true because there isn't enough evidence to prove it's not. This can actually manifest as an attempt by the communicator to do something called shifting the burden of proof. I've seen this several times where there's a shifting of burden of proof from someone making a claim to the opposition or to the person who's just raising any questions. They might say that, well, we know what we're doing. It's working for us. It's up to you to find evidence that it doesn't work or it's not real. And this is shifting the burden of proof. And actually, when it comes to logic, discourse, across several different fields, the burden of proof is considered to be the obligation of the person making the claim. And it's considered to be not your opposition's responsibility to prove your claims incorrect. If you're making novel claims about something, or you're supporting a big paradigm shift, the general consensus is that it's up to you to prove that to be correct to the best of your ability. Now, people who oppose it or question it, they can also make arguments, but the true burden of proof is on the person who's showing up and making a big claim. And I have seen this a couple times particularly on Instagram posts and comments, this idea about naysayers, and that the naysayers need to do the work to prove things wrong, because on the side of Gestalt language processing, and it's not like there's, clear black and white sides across every SLP who's interested in this, but people who support GLP and the concepts behind it say, like, we know it works. Like, you figure out and prove it wrong if you can. So that's appeal to ignorance. And I want you to take a beat and think about, can you identify or think back to where appeal to ignorance may be coming up in things that you've read about GLP, perhaps in other areas that you're interested in as an SLP? Also think about, has any of this come up when you think about politicians and the way that they speak about their platforms, why you should vote for them, or in other forms of media? Fallacies come up across all forms of communication. Let's move on to the next informal fallacy. The next fallacy I want to talk about as related to Gestalt language processing information is the definist fallacy. And this has to do with definitions, or how we define the concepts in our argument. The definist fallacy is present when someone who's communicating, perhaps someone making a post or a comment, they define a concept in biased terms to support their argument. They frame a concept with bias to set themselves up for more success and set up their opponent or the person they disagree with for less success. Now, the aim of the way that they're defining something or partially defining something, when we think about something like Gestalt language processing, language acquisition, verbal behavior, SLP, ABA, we're very often dealing in partial definitions because these concepts or these frameworks or these approaches are so nuanced. Now, the aim of creating a definition or partial definition can function in a couple ways. One function could be that the person who's responding to the biased definition is just going to accept your argument because they feel like you've put them in a very sticky position. They're like, oh, okay, if you're going to frame it that way, I'm just going to accept your argument and move on. The person responding to that definist fallacy, they may have a hard time even showing up to refute that argument because a lot of emotions arise. If the definition that the person is coming up with is putting you in an emotional spot, which may even play into the emotional fallacy, which we'll talk about soon. Emotions may come up in a way that you're not able to access your logic anymore. And you may also be worried about the conversation continuing in this public forum in a way that you might lose credibility, or you may upset people, or you may look like the bad guy. A lot of emotions can come up in these conversations because our jobs are important to us. We really tend to care about the things we're doing. Another function of creating a definition or a partial definition to position ourselves in certain ways is that we may instigate a bandwagon effect, which we'll also talk about soon. We may create an in-group effect where other people might start to comment who also disagree with that claim. They want to join in and help promote their cause or disagree with something. And then we've got a bandwagon full of comments that can sway the conversation one way or another. Now, all of this is part of discourse. There's nothing wrong with having a lot of comments under something to discuss. But it is just something interesting to note and see, okay, is there a definition here being created to sway a reader one way or another, rather than a more evidence-based definition? Okay, so I want to look at two phrases from Instagram comments that might be applying the definist fallacy. The first one is, your social media account only calling for quantitative evidence means that you don't believe that the wealth of community evidence that parent perspectives are valuable. So to interpret that, this potential comment and this comment that is pulling from a couple different comments I've seen is that certain social media accounts that tend to call for more quantitative evidence around Gestalt processing, there's a belief from the commenter that that is not taking into account or not valuing parent perspectives, parents of GLPs. Now, another kind of Frankenstein comment that might be playing into the definist fallacy is someone saying, only sharing anecdotes is a cherry picking of success stories. Your rejection of empiricism shows me how much NLI relies on confirmation bias. So this person might be defining the use of success stories and anecdotes as a rejection of empiricism, when in fact, it may not be for the person who's posting it. Now, with these above claims, they're really positioning their argument by defining the other person's values for them. They're defining the limits of that other person's persona or account or argumentation for them with kind of a sticky argument at the end of not valuing parent perspectives or rejecting empiricism. Now, they're creating definitions of that poster's communication style, and that in a way kind of sets them up to serve their own position, where we can guess that the person in that first comment really values parent perspectives and maybe doesn't as much value looking for more quantitative evidence. We might guess that. Whereas in the second comment, we can see that wanting more empiricism or relying upon empiricism seems to be a value of the second commenter, and they don't like confirmation bias, and they don't like the idea of cherry picking success stories. So we can kind of see what are the values and perspectives of the person commenting, but also the way that they're kind of setting up the other person for failure, which isn't always good faith discourse. Now, the way that people who use the definite fallacy can make it difficult to have solid discourse in a clinical field or clinical conversations is that they kind of make it difficult for the original poster or OP to argue that they do indeed value the other side of it, or that their claim is more nuanced. For example, when someone argues for more quantitative research under this commenter's definition, and then it looks as if no matter what they say next, that they are devaluing parent perspectives rather than valuing, or valuing at the same time, just wanting a hierarchy of evidence quality. It's not either or, it's both. When someone might be arguing that a clinician is engaging only in confirmation bias, you're just posting the success stories. It might be hard for that original poster to argue that they also value empirical information seeking, because you've already set me up for failure by defining me and defining my argument by what it lacks, or trying to tell me what I don't value. Definite fallacy, and you can, when you think about these two comments about you don't believe in parent perspectives being valuable, you're cherry picking, you're rejecting. These claims also tend to play to emotion and hyperbole, and we're going to talk about those things soon in an upcoming slide. Now, another informal fallacy that I anecdotally see often is a false dilemma around Gestalt language processing. The false dilemma fallacy presents information as if there are a fixed number of explanations for something. There are a fixed number of choices. Very often the false dilemma fallacy is talking about two choices, but we may see more than that. So the false dilemma, it's a presentation style of information that creates a forcing function on your mind, especially when we think about how quickly we might move through social media, especially when I think about for myself, if I'm looking for answers about a client and how to help them, I want to find those answers fast. I want to find them now. I want to find them yesterday. And so a false dilemma might create a forcing function for my attention span and the emotions of really wanting something soon to make me as a reader and a consumer of information make a choice more quickly than I might want to. It also might, as a false dilemma, kind of filter my attention and perspective to interpret the rest of the information on that post, on that slide, through those limited choices. Instead of thinking, wait, there might be 7 other options, and there might be 6 other options we haven't even thought of, anybody has even thought of. Now, those 2 or more false dilemma options or choices can sometimes be really extreme options. They might also be really oversimplified categories. We might see a false choice that feels really black and white, might feel very either or. Sometimes it seems kind of us versus them. And what happens in these situations is this tends to have an impact on good faith discourse. In black and white, us versus them choices or presentations of information, unfortunately, honest and authentic debate can be limited. And in my experience, it's more likely to lead to contentious debate. So here's one that I see often when it comes to GLP discourse. Children can either be Gestalt language processors, analytic language processors, or dual processors. Now, this might seem really satisfying to read. Oh, phew. Only 3 categories. What a relief. The kids I'm working with, no matter how complex their profiles are, good, they fit into one of these categories. What a relief for me as a clinician. It may also be a relief for a caregiver who's looking for answers about their kid. Maybe they just received an autism diagnosis. They really want answers. They want to know what to do. They're motivated. And it might be really soothing or exciting or a relief to see, okay, there's 3 categories of language processing. Once I figure that out, I'll know what to do. So this claim seems to create a choice between 3 distinct categories of these language processing profiles. But have these profiles been well operationalized in terms of data collection, discourse between fields, consensus among many professionals? Also, are these 3 categories terms that have been consistently studied, not just studied in a certain period of time, but consistently studied, replicated? This claim also assumes that the person claiming it has a really deep and fully factual understanding of what language processing actually is. And we want to think about that language acquisition and language processing is a continued debate between many fields. Language processing is being actively studied and actively debated every single day. We don't have clear answers yet. We're working towards it, but it's a complicated phenomenon. Another social media claim that may include a false dilemma would be, if we aren't regulated, we cannot access language or learn at all. We have to be regulated for language modeling to work. So this claim seems to posit that there is a fixed choice between regulated equals learning and language versus dysregulated equals no learning and no language. However, is there evidence or enough evidence that no language, and also have we determined if that's expressive, receptive, both? So is there evidence that truly no language can be accessed when dysregulated? And also, what does accessed mean in this claim? Is there evidence that children truly cannot learn new things when they're dysregulated? And also, what are the parameters of learning? How are we operationalizing learning in this context? And I know I've been saying that word a lot, but operationalizing the terms that we're using is really important to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. Now, I also want to think about in this claim, what do we mean by regulation? Are we referring to all of the sensory systems at once? Are we talking about emotional regulation, sensory regulation, both at the same time? And we also want to consider that regulation looks different for everyone, and regulation is also constantly in flux. It's not a static state. So how are we talking about regulation here? I think the last interesting thing is that the use of the pronoun we. If we aren't regulated, we cannot access. We have to be regulated. It implies everyone. But is this claim actually true for all populations? Or is this claim true for certain populations? And I also do want to add on that this is using pretty confirmatory language. If we aren't language, we cannot access. We have to be. And that's some strong language there, rather than using conditional language of, if we aren't regulated, we might not be able to. We seem to need, or we might need to be, kind of that protective language, that conditional language, that it may not always be the case. Claiming that it's always the case might be tapping into some hyperbole, which might take us outside, the realm of being able to make claims for everyone. Can we truly make a claim for every single person, every single human being? It's just things to think about when you're reading information. Now, choices that are presented with a false dilemma, they may serve a function to divert your attention away from opposing views or more complex choices. And it kind of nudges a reader to what the person making the argument deems to be the right decision, the right way to do therapy, the right way to support language, the right way to conceptualize language processing. And false dilemmas are also pretty common in divisive language, us versus them language. So in these two examples, I want to see if you can notice the false dilemma. You're either with us or you're against us. Something like, we believe in Gestalt language processing, and those that don't aren't neurodiversity affirming. Now, these are two dilemmas that may provoke fear in someone reading it, of the fear of, okay, well, I wanted to investigate this and I wanted to kind of question parts of this, but does that mean I'm not neurodiversity affirming? Or does that mean I'm against you? I don't want to be against you. I want to be neurodiversity affirming, but I also want to ask more questions. It kind of puts the reader in a sticky situation. Okay, so the next one is called a circular argument. A circular argument occurs when both sides of a claim are reliant on the other part of the claim being truthful. So the statement itself of a circular argument, it kind of defines itself with its own definition. And the argument for that claim, it makes an assumption that the claim is true because it's true. And I think that this one is best explained through some examples, because that definition can be a little bit muddy. So I want to share some examples that are cobbled together from several different quotes, again, just to protect those who have written it. And by the way, I've also pulled some of these from the things I wrote in the past, because like I said in the beginning, I am full of logical fallacies. Okay, so here's one that kind of has elements of circular logic. My client is a Gestalt language processor because he processes language in Gestalts. There's a circular nature there. My client is a GLP because he processes language in Gestalts. Gestalt, Gestalt. But it hasn't really given us new information to support the claim that this description fits him. And it hasn't actually defined what a Gestalt is. Now, the argument may go on further from that, but this line on its own is a bit circular. Another one you might see would be sessions with a GLP must be child-led because adult-led sessions just don't work. So sessions must be child-led because adult-led sessions just don't work. You might read that and be like, yeah, child-led sessions, definitely. And yeah, adult-led sessions, haven't really, I get it. But is there actually any evidence there? I don't see any evidence for that. I might agree with both sides of it because of my personal experiences. But if you're making a claim that sessions have to be child-led, is there evidence about outcomes? Is there evidence about progress patterns? Is there, are we looking to any data that actually supports child-led versus adult-led? Going off of more than just gut anecdotal experience, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is anecdotes are really important. They're really powerful in our field. And also, they're a starting point. The next one, you might see something to the tune of natural language acquisition is the best approach because it is natural. And you can see it's similar to that first one of natural language acquisition is the best approach because it's natural. It's natural, so we use natural language acquisition. And again, this might move on to the argument may be longer with good information and evidence for what naturalness is in your interactions with the child, but we're not actually getting a definition here. We're defining something with its own definition, but it's not going beyond that word. Another one, you might see something to the tune of Gestalt language processing is real because we see it before our very eyes. The reality is right there with our GLPs. This sounds really nice. It sounds so lovely. This thing is real. This profile is real. I see it right there in my clients. That reality in my clients, that's the proof. It's right there in our GLPs. But this again hinges upon personal experience. I know this to be true because I see it in front of me. I believe it. That reality of that GLP is what I need. It's proof to me. That's personal experience with it. And I know for me, I read something like that, and part of me is like, yes, every day in this clinic that I'm sitting in, I work with kids who fit that profile of a GLP. I see the progress before my very eyes using techniques from natural language acquisition. It's what I do. And also, saying it's right in front of me is not really strong evidence. Because have I been tracking language acquisition patterns? Do I have strong data that all of the techniques I'm using are really helping? Or are there certain techniques I'm using that actually aren't leading to progress? And maybe I'm not using my time as wisely as I could. Perhaps I'm trying to see something before my very eyes and I'm engaging in confirmation bias because this kid in front of me fits the profile of GLP. But what if the techniques aren't really helping them that much? Then I might try to convince myself it's right before my eyes when it's not actually happening. Circular arguments can be reductive. We see it before our very eyes, the reality is right there, but why? I want to know more about what's happening in the brain and body. But if I'm just pointing to something as reality, it's pretty reductive. I want to go further than that, than this argument. Another one might be verbal behavior works because all verbal language is behavior. Expressive language is a set of behaviors. You might see this on a really pretty Instagram post. And your immediate reaction might be, oh yeah, all expressive language is behavior. Yeah. It's all these different behaviors going together to communicate something. But it's defining itself with its own definition here. Verbal behavior works because all verbal language is behavior. Expressive language is a set of behaviors. Like some of the other ones, could be a good starting point for the rest of the argument. But on its own, and think back to the idea of social media, really rests upon a lot of brevity and get that idea out there, boom, get that attention. If the post is just this, are we really getting into the evidence underneath it of why do you want to use verbal behavior approaches? What does it mean that it works? And then, is it the best approach? We need more evidence behind it than just creating that connection between definition and defining it with its own definition. And it's kind of a recycling of ideas that it reinforces itself. And to someone reading it, they might be like, well, yeah, of course, that makes sense. I'm seeing the same words lining up. The claim and the argument relate to each other. That makes sense. But if you look a little bit deeper, there's just this recycling going on of the vocabulary rather than going deeper. And good arguments tend to go deeper. Here's another one that I find interesting. And this is one that a lot of people have probably heard of. This is called the bandwagon effect. So, where did this name come from? The bandwagon effect actually comes from the 19th century. And this was happening during elections where when your candidate was running for election, they would actually go by in a bandwagon. And if you supported them and you were going to vote for them, you actually physically got up on their bandwagon with them. This showed your support. It physically got you close to the person that you wanted to support. And when we're drawn to someone, we might want to be close to them. But it also served to show other people your beliefs. And so as more and more people hopped on the bandwagon, more and more people saw others on the bandwagon. And what happens in the bandwagon effect is that more and more people get interested. more and more people pay attention. You might be more likely to want to know about something if you see your neighbor up on that physical bandwagon. Oh, the clerk at the store in my 19th century town is up on that bandwagon. I wonder why. I trust them. I wonder why they're going to vote for that candidate. Maybe I should vote for them too. Another name for the bandwagon effect is called the appeal to common belief. So the idea of a common belief. A lot of people around me, people I respect, a plurality of people in my life, they believe this thing. And when it comes to this effect or this fallacy, it's making an argument that your claim is true because everyone in your in-group believes it. So we think of in-group and out-group. In-group is a group that you feel yourself to belong to. It might be a religious group. It might be a friend group. Perhaps it's the profession you're in. You feel a strong sense of identity as a speech-language pathologist. Maybe you're a runner or a dancer, a Democrat, an independent. All of these are groups that may feel like an in-group to you, where you share certain beliefs, you share certain language, you share certain behaviors and life choices. And then there's also the idea of the out-group, which is an identity or a group that you don't belong in. And in fact, you may view, and not you, but the general you may believe that their practices, their choices, and their beliefs are somehow wrong, too different than yours, or maybe even a threat to you and your in-group. And so if there's a claim that is operating in your in-group, you may be more prone to believe it and hop on that bandwagon because you see other people in your in-group already riding on it. And then what might happen is you hop on that bandwagon too, and then other people who respect you and believe you in other ways, they say, okay, let me get on there too. I trust you. Now, it also talks about this idea that it's not just the other people that find it popular, but that the idea itself tends to rise in popularity because it seems so well regarded. If people in your in-group are talking about it a lot, they're referring to it a lot, they're not talking about other modalities, they're not talking about other forms of language acquisition, they're not talking about other therapy techniques anymore. There's so much attention on it, which is called the attentional bias, that you may start to not even think about these other modalities or frameworks anymore. It's so well regarded and so often talked about that your attention goes there. So here's a couple of examples that may be playing into the bandwagon effect. The first one is, once again, this is a culmination of several different examples that play to the underlying content, not a single example. For over a decade, success stories about GLPs have flooded Instagram and Facebook, making their way across many nations and have been captured in presentations and webinars by dozens of therapists. We are thrilled. So I want you to think about what might be happening there with the ideas of common belief, bandwagon, well-regarded, popular. I'm going to read it again, see if you can notice some of the linguistic moments that might be promoting bandwagon. For over a decade, success stories have flooded Instagram and Facebook, making their way across many nations and have been captured in presentations and webinars by dozens of therapists. We are thrilled. So a couple things are happening here that may play into bandwagon. The first is talking about a decade that, oh, this belief has existed in our in-group for a long time. Success stories have flooded in. Think about the imagery of a flood. It's not a trickle. It's not slowly built up. There's been a flood of it. Whoa, this must be really popular. This idea of going across many nations. Okay, this is international. There must be truth and veracity to it if it's made its way across many languages and many cultures. And then the idea, it's been presented on by dozens of therapists. You can see there's quantity language in this. There's quantity and intensity language, flooded, many, dozens. And the idea of we are thrilled. The use of the word we can tap into that in-group feeling. When someone writes the word we, you as the reader might feel like, oh, I'm a part of that. Yeah, I am thrilled. And it's important to note that from what I'm, from my experience of learning about GLP NLA and all of that, nothing in here is actually wrong. For over a decade, yep, success stories flooding in. I've definitely witnessed that. And from a lot of people I've talked to, they witness a lot of success stories in their clients, in the posts that they see, in the comments they see. This information has made its way across many different countries. And more people are doing presentations and webinar. And a lot of people in the in-group are thrilled. So nothing in here is striking me as incorrect. But you can see that the way the language is presented can enhance that bandwagon effect, or could. Another one we might see, and this is a compilation, or like a Frankenstein, GLP is a fad. The hype will die down eventually, and then we can all get back to evidence-based practice. So I want you to think about if there's anything in here that might play into bandwagon for the in-group that this might be speaking towards, or the in-group that the person claiming it might want to create. And I think it's for both of them. It's not just the in-group that exists, but are you positioning your language to try and increase your in-group or even pull over people from the, quote, other side? GLP is a fad. The hype will die down eventually, and we can all get back to evidence-based practice. So let's take a look at a couple of the linguistic choices. So the word fad, that kind of talks about there's a group of people who are really excited about something that will inherently go away. That's what a fad is. Really popular, but not for long. So that's kind of positioning out group versus in group. The hype will die down. So there's some intense language there. Like hype is a high energy word. Die down, the word die. And then the use of we. Then we can all get back to evidence-based practice is, again, if you read the word we, you might be called into that in-group. Okay, yeah, we can get back there. We can get back to what we know to be real and true. So this one might be playing into another group who disagrees with ideas of Gestalt language processing. So when it comes to the bandwagon effect or the appeal to common belief fallacy, this fallacy, it really encourages consumers of the information to question their opposition. And not just question, but it may even create more divisiveness. It may create some animosity between the two groups. And there aren't always just two groups. That is also black and white. But discourse like this and claims like this may make it seem like there's black and white and us versus them. And the encouragement to question opposing viewpoints, either from those out-group members, at least perceiving those out-group members, but also I think it's important to note that questioning opposition from in-group members who have doubts and questions can happen. And just from my own personal anecdotal experience, I consider myself an in-group member. Again, I specialize in working with Gestalt language processors. It's what I research, it's what I love, it's what I do. And I'm skeptical. I have doubts. I have questions. I want to know more. I want to know why. And I also want to know about, for whom does this approach not work? What do we want to know about that? But I have experienced some pushback and some uncomfortable conversations from other people in that in-group who are confused why I'm asking questions like that. Why would an in-group member like me want more quantitative information? So it's really interesting to see how bandwagon can come up against not just out-group, but also in group who are asking certain questions and want to know more. We also want to think about, why does this happen as humans? I'm always curious about, what is that underlying human need that we act in certain ways? Humans are social creatures. We want community. We want to share community. And often community cohesion comes by conforming to group behaviors. They make us feel close to each other. And I think conforming often has a negative connotation, but conforming can also have a lot of benefits. It can help us feel close to other people. It can help us feel safe. It can help us communicate in ways that don't take as much detail or don't take as much labor, because we've got some conforming behaviors and ideas. Now, the bandwagon effect, when we think about that desire for community, the desire for cohesion, to get along and be close, the bandwagon effect can be a really powerful device for clinicians out there who might doubt themselves. I think back to myself as a clinical fellow, and so many clinical fellows who I talk to now or who just came out of it, and they share anecdotes being like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I just did 2 years of school and I have no clue what I'm doing. I doubt myself every day. For someone in that position, or perhaps someone who has imposter syndrome, this idea that like, people trust me and I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. Those people might be susceptible to a bandwagon statement because they're looking for someone to tell them, don't doubt yourself. I have the answer for you. I can give you the answer. Or if someone has imposter syndrome, perhaps a bandwagon claim of, this is working. What we're doing is working. Like, look at all this success that we're doing when it comes to Gestalt language processing, or when it comes to verbal behavior. When we think about some of the opposition that therapists in the in group that I, tend to identify with, we look at verbal behavior and say, no, no, no. People who might be questioning on either side and having imposter syndrome on either side, bandwagon may help them determine, where am I going to feel like less of an imposter? Bandwagon may also be helpful if you feel threatened by a clinical idea, an old one or a new one. And so the ideas around GLP and NLA, they might feel threatening to a clinician who's been practicing a certain way for 10, 15 years. And with their autistic clients, what they've been doing is working, or they believe in it. And in their experience, that's working. But then all these new ideas come in, or not, not all of them are new, but this reformed profile of characteristics and approaches that may have new names comes along. There may be a threat response there of, whoa, 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 I have to change so much of what I do now. That's a big change. So bandwagon may make them feel they want to go either way, to feel soothed in who they are, what they're doing, and what they want to do next. I know for me, when I encounter a clinical idea that brings up that threat response, my first reaction is to seek out information that makes me feel better, that confirms my existing beliefs, because I am so human. I want those uncomfortable feelings to go away when I feel challenged by a new clinical idea or an opposing one. And I want to seek out something that feels like I'm back on that bandwagon. Pull me back up, guys. I feel uncomfortable. But being able to name that and know what that feeling is and sit with it has helped me not get swept back up onto that bandwagon as much. It feels really, really good when someone communicating on social media, whether that's about Gestalt language processing, about myofunctional therapy, about articulation, about prompt, about any of the things we might do as clinicians, when they make our decision making feel easier. We think about, so many SLPs are burnt out or exhausted. The caseloads are huge. If you're in a state without caseload caps, you're traveling house to house, really tired generally. And I know from personal experience, there's not a lot of time to do that digging, to go into the in-depth decision-making that we wish we could do. And so if someone else can make the decision-making happen for us and reduce that need to really critically think about a topic that's important to us. I know for me, it's really important to me to know what I'm doing with autistic kids, show up for them with all the information I can. But the time that can go into that, when more and more research is coming out, it's a lot. If I perceive someone else to have done all that deep thinking for me and synthesized all of that into what seems to be a clear approach or protocol, what a relief. Thank you. Okay, let me take this and use it. I'm so relieved that this has all been synthesized for me. But that might trap us somehow. We may not actually be doing the level of interrogation and investigation that we need to know that the information we're taking off that post or that article or that series of comments is presenting to us. But the bandwagon language and bandwagon effect can make it seem really appealing. It may make us look at a really big Facebook group and think, oh my gosh, there's so many thousands of people in here. What's in here is probably true. We might look at a GLP Instagram post that has hundreds of likes and think, okay, hundreds of other people, 1,045 people like this. Okay, I might be able to rely on this information. Maybe a webinar where dozens or hundreds of people attend to learn more about how GLP is a fad and there's no evidence for it. And you think, okay, there's hundreds of people here. All these people can't be wrong, right? Bandwagon can have a big impact on how we process information. But the one I most want you to come away with when it comes to social media discourse about Gestalt language processing, natural language acquisition, echolalia, applied behavioral analysis, neurodiversity affirming practice, all of these big terms that are the importance of them for SLPs who are on social media who are wanting to work with autistic kids and Gestalt language processors. So much of what I'm seeing in this phenomena and the patterns that I'm perceiving, as well as the patterns that other SLPs I talk to regularly about fallacies coming up, we point to this one most often: appeal to emotion. And so this is one I'd love for you to come away with. Just start to notice. Notice what appeals to your emotion. Notice what might be appealing to caregiver emotion in the claims and arguments. What might be appealing to the emotion of other practitioners who are reading this information, maybe occupational therapists who want to learn more about language, physical therapists who want to learn more about using prosody and musical intonation, maybe music therapists who are very curious about the overlap of prosody and intonation for Gestalt language processors and how they can use music with them. Start to notice how these emotional language techniques might be impacting other professionals in your clinic or perhaps in a study group. And I want you to start to not only notice how it's impacting you and those other people, but how might the language choices, how are those being used and constructed by the person making the post on the comment that are making you feel that way? And once again, it may not be intentional and it may be in good faith by the person writing it. It's hard to know because, it's on social media and we don't necessarily have personal relationships with the people making these posts or what's been referred to as the GLP influencers. So let's get to it. What is the appeal to emotion fallacy? The appeal to emotion fallacy arises when a communicator, someone posting or commenting, tries to make a convincing argument for something by evoking feelings rather than sharing strong evidence. Now, the emotional reactions that a reader may have to these arguments, it might lead to acceptance that what they're saying is true because it can create a really strong emotional bond between the person making the claim, so maybe the GLP influencer or the parent influencer, and the person consuming the information. Because of that, elicitation of emotion, it can create this sense of a bond, even though those people have never met in real life, or even maybe talked in direct messages, or that bond can be lit, that flame of bond can be lit just through eliciting emotion through language choices or even visual choices, through maybe something like videos or reels or TikToks. Some of the emotions that might be evoked could be fear, relief, excitement, anger, and soothing. And I wanted to share some examples of phrases that might elicit each of these feelings. And I want you to think about if your time consuming information on social media about GLP or really any other area related to your profession, or honestly, beyond that, think about politics, think about different lifestyle accounts, think about different social issues in your community, or perhaps in your creative world, your religious world. Where might emotions be evoked to persuade you about something or try and help you to make a choice? So the first one might be fear. You might encounter a claim like, if you don't do this, your client will blank. So if you don't model in this way, your client might get stuck. And I know for me, even just saying that line, even though I wrote it and I read it, I get a tightness in my stomach from it. It elicits an emotional response in me. You may not have that. I tend to be of the more emotional sort. You may not be of that sort. But it's that if you don't blank, then your client will blank. And it might bring up fear of, oh my gosh, if I don't do this thing for my client, then maybe this bad thing will happen. I'm really afraid of that happening. So I better do what this person is saying to prevent that. So it might be a fear-based, it might elicit some fear. But then think back to what bond that might create. Okay, I'm afraid of something, or now I'm afraid of something, but the person saying it has the answer. Okay, you have the answer to my fear. I trust you. So it creates that little bond there, allegedly, theoretically, potentially. Another one that might create fear is this idea that compliance-based therapy will ... So like compliance-based therapy will lead to your client masking and end up with them in burnout. And I might read that or say that, be like, oh my gosh, compliance-based therapy will lead to my client masking and getting burnt out later in life. Okay, I can't do compliance-based therapy. Oh my gosh, what if I am? What if I don't even realize I am? It might lead you to this kind of frantic questioning or incessant questioning of everything you're doing. And then you might want to turn to the person saying it, turn to their knowledge, turn to their wisdom and say, okay, can you tell me what compliance-based therapy is and what it's not? So I can make sure that this fear I have of potentially causing burnout and masking my client, I can prevent that. So it might create that bond of trust again of, you're saying that this will happen to my clients. You must have the answer for how to prevent that. And they might. But if that's the only thing that's written on that snappy post or that snappy story, you may be coming away with just that line that has potentially created fear in you. And now you're going to look to that person for the answers. It's set up this relationship between you, potentially. Another emotion that might come up is relief. There might be this overwhelming feeling of relief when you read something that someone on social media posts about GLP or something else related. Something like, if you do this strategy, your child will finally blank. For example, if you model naturally, your child will finally look at you with that bingo eye contact. And it's that feeling of, okay, finally. I know as a clinician, I might experience that relief in reading something like this for a child with a more complex profile who doesn't have a lot of joint attention from what I can perceive, and think, okay, if I do this thing you're saying, I'm going to have that moment where my client looks at me like that and I can feel relieved, and the parents will feel relieved. And for parents who might be stressed and scared, the relief they feel at a claim like that. Okay, let me do this. You're saying I should do it? You have the answer to this? Okay, what a relief that it might work. Another one that I see pretty often actually is some form of, after I made these changes, after I started doing these techniques, I actually felt like I was helping my clients. And that may be true, of course. But if that is presented as a claim that other people want to jump onto, or if that is used in lieu of evidence for how certain techniques tap into the brain and change certain things, you might look to that as, okay, well, you made those changes and you felt like you were helping. Maybe that's proof that I need to make those changes so I can feel like I'm helping. And it comes back to that feeling. We might also think about how appeal to emotion can lead to excitement. This might tap into maybe some magical imagery. Things like watching this client's language unfold is just magical. And I'm guilty of using words like that. I look back at some of my old communication patterns and posts. I really like to use the word magical. And magic is not really what we're doing around here. It might feel that way sometimes, but communicating about our clinical world and our decision making for clients, in my opinion, bringing magic into that just doesn't feel very appropriate. So watching language unfold is just magical. If I read something like that as a parent or a clinician who's looking for answers, I want to feel magic. Okay, let me try these things so I can feel magic in my job. And another one I see is some form of, doing this, I fell back in love with my career. And that may be true for the person saying it. But if that is presented in lieu of strong evidence that I did these techniques and I fell back in love with my career, that's wonderful. On a personal, feeling-based, anecdotal level, that happened to me. But it doesn't mean that that is proof that certain techniques work for the clients. It's proof that I personally had a shift in my relationship to my work once I started operating according to this framework. Another emotion that might come up is anger. One that I see often is some form of, no one was taught this in grad school. Why weren't we taught this in grad school? There's that feeling of anger there. And it's kind of tapping into this idea of, we weren't taught this in grad school, but like, it's true. Like, this is so, all of this, it's so valid. It's so true. We should have been taught it then. And it kind of positions this information as something that was gatekept or held back or not seen as important. And that contrast, it kind of, when you lean into that, then the other side of that is, okay, well, it's really important. If there's this, if there's this claim of no one was taught this in grad school, it kind of positions you to think, well, it should be taught now. It must be really important. This is something that needs to be taught. So it might bring up some anger of, why wasn't I taught this? And another one I hear is, and I just heard it today from a caregiver, why don't more people know about this? Oh, I'm so frustrated. Why don't more people know about this? And you could, come into that, and that might be, a feeling about it, or it may be based on, you think about all the clinicians in your area, and you may be one of the few clinicians who is exploring this and trying on these ideas and experimenting with it. So you may be kind of isolated in that, but think about how that kind of rhetoric can bring up that feeling of anger. And if you're using these emotional techniques with language, again, that's creating in-group cohesion, but it's happening through anger, excitement, relief, fear, soothing, rather than through strong evidence. And then soothing might come up. Something like, you are not alone in this journey of relearning. Like, you're not alone. We're all in this together. We're learning about this together. Again, can be true. We're all learning about something new together. But if you're tapping into that feeling of trying to assuage some loneliness or feeling isolated, are you using emotion to pull people in and bring them to your side without presenting strong evidence. Or then something like language just happens when given the right supports. What a soothing thought that language will just happen. But is that true? And if that is true, then if it's just happening, then what's our job? So there's just, you notice these certain language choices that might position the reader to make choices based on the feelings it evokes, rather than looking at, is there good data for this? What are the outcomes like? Are we really tapping into the parts of the brain that can lead to long-lasting linguistic change? And can we even make these big claims yet? I feel it's important to note that not all emotional appeals include fallacy. Emotional experiences, especially when it comes to the therapeutic domain, we're dealing with human beings. Emotional experiences can be really valid indicators within a stronger argument, especially when we're thinking about anecdotal evidence, when we're thinking about community reactions, when we're thinking about the quality of a session and the connection and rapport building. Emotion is important to consider. It can motivate clients, it can motivate families, it can motivate us and help support that progress. Because if we can harness that emotional appeal for people, we know how to motivate them better. But I just want to be wary of social media communication that tends to substitute emotion for evidence. Why not play with both? Or why not present really strong evidence that naturally leads to that emotional reaction, because it's leading to the outcomes that genuinely lead to relief, excitement, and soothing, because we've used the data and the science to get to the outcomes rather than the promise of an outcome. So here are several ways I want you to look out for that someone might create what's called an emotional hook. Metaphor and analogy. Once again, I want to make very clear, I live in metaphor and analogy. I find these to be very effective for communicating ideas to others, but you want to just be mindful of when that's a hook for something that's not actually sharing evidence. So metaphor and analogy are very compelling comparisons. They can help reduce the complexity of ideas. They can also make them way more memorable and emotionally salient. Metaphor tends to intensify information because it uses imagery. Analogies can actually be carefully chosen to tap into the interests and perspectives of a listener. I know one of my clients' fathers, he loves to run. So I'll talk about language in terms of, mechanics and speed and, physicality. And that helps him be like, okay, that makes sense to me. It's not to say that these devices of metaphor and analogy are not immensely helpful in communicating to others who are not in our field. But it's just a heads up to think critically about, how are these imagery devices being used to share clinical information? Are we reducing the information to get into the emotions more so? Stories and anecdotes. Big, big, big when it comes to GLP information. I love reading them. I love them. I share often about my own clients' success stories and anecdotes. They're powerful. They're memorable vehicles. They capture larger ideas. They have their place. They communicate ideas related to human experiences. They give us hope. They make us excited. But the information presented may have limited evidence. They may be exaggerated. They may contain biases. Our memories tend to change over time. They may have confirmation bias, survivorship bias. They're a great starting point. And then we start there, and then we want to pursue higher levels of evidence that are less likely, hopefully, to contain bias, and more likely to be communicated to a wider range of professionals rather than just social media. Other professionals are going to want to look at evidence from our field, not just anecdotes. And we also want to look for emotionally or morally charged language. I want you to start to take note, when we think about linguistic choices, of any claims or arguments that tap into moral, identity, spiritual, magical, or hyperbolic language to potentially sway your emotions. So moral and identity, perhaps something like, if you truly care about autistic individuals, you will blank. Or perhaps, that kind of therapy is abuse. taps into that moral fear of, oh my gosh, I don't want to be abusive. Perhaps something like real clinicians use science, not stories. And that taps into real, am I a real clinician identity? Or something as simple as we as SLPs must, because then you're thinking, I'm an SLP, so must I do this? Now, one I do see, interestingly, when it comes to, I in particular see it with GLP discourse, is almost some spiritual imagery, which I think is interesting. Perhaps something like, we have faith in our GLPs, or the evidence we need from the past must be resurrected. Faith and resurrected, I have seen written. Something like, when a GLP looks at you like that, the feeling is just heavenly. And that may be true for the person speaking it, but clinician to clinician, perhaps there's a more effective clinical word for what you're noticing. Something like, the magic of the shift from stage 2 to stage 3 will knock you off your feet. So speaking to magic. Or something like, using sensory integration restored my client's faith in the world. It's a beautiful image, but do we actually know that about a child? Just something to consider. And then also looking for hyperbole. Something like, when you learn about this, or when you take my course, you will acquire everything you need to be able to help your GLP. It's a pretty big claim, everything. Something like, once you enter stage 3, the sky is truly the limit. Beautiful imagery. But is that hyperbolic? Something like, stage 4 means that the entire world of grammar lies ahead for them. So we see these words of the sky's the limit, everything, the entire world. But is that actually true? Can we actually make that jump that the entire world of grammar is ahead for them? What if they never acquire advanced adverbial clauses? How can we truly know that? Or something like, we must engage in complete acceptance of GLPs, ... Complete, entire, everything. These are some words that might be playing to hyperbole and might be tapping into our emotions. And so, what I want you to think about when it comes to these formal and informal fallacies, which ones stood out most to you? Were there any that really caught your attention? Whether it's because, oh, you realized you might use them, not just in your work, but perhaps in communicating to friends, or trying to make your point with your child's soccer coach, or when it comes to political arguments. Are there any fallacies we talked about that you notice in your consumption of GLP information? And what are 1 or 2 logical fallacies you'll definitely be looking for the next time that you're consuming information about GLP and related modalities? Thank you so much for tuning in to this live podcast episode about logical fallacies. If you found this interesting, don't worry. We have part 2 coming in December, where I'll be going through a whole new list of logical fallacies and where they seem to crop up in GLP discourse. I want to emphasize one more time, I think it's so important that working with GLPs is truly the highlight of my career. I love this framework. And I also am so passionate about wanting to learn more and making sure that this thing I care about so much is talked about and consumed in a way that's going to give it longevity, in a way that's going to help other fields start to take these ideas seriously, as well as try and find where the weaknesses are so that we, as a GLP community or in group, can make stronger arguments. And so that brings us to the end of the podcast. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions about this webinar. You can find me on Instagram at crescendo.communication, which I'll be putting in the chat. Definitely feel free to reach out if anything came up about logical fallacies, and especially if you notice any in yourself or in something you come up with on social media, let me know. I'd love to hear if you're able to apply this. Thank you for joining the Gestalt Get Together, and we look forward to seeing you again at another Speech Therapy PD course. Thanks so much for joining us on today's podcast. Remember to go to speechtherapypd.com to learn more about earning ASHA CEUs. We want you to get credit for the hard work you've put in to further your education. We also appreciate your support. We'd love for you to write a quick review of the podcast and subscribe. If you're listening on a streaming platform, feel free to rate us. 5 stars is great, 4 stars is awesome, but we also appreciate honesty around here if it's lower. That way, your ratings and your reviews will help get our podcast to more clinicians like you, as well as parents and people from other professions who might benefit from learning about Gestalt language processing. Now, if you've indicated that you are part of the ASHA registry and entered both your ASHA number and a complete address in your account profile prior to the course completion, we will submit earned CEUs to ASHA for you. Please allow 1 to 2 months from the completion date for your CEUs to be reflected on your ASHA transcript. And also, please don't hesitate to tell us which topics you would like us to cover in future episodes. To get in touch, drop us a line in the comments section or send us a message on social media. We'd love to hear who you want us to interview, what topics are on your mind, and where you'd like us to investigate when it comes to the world of GLP. Okay, but here's the really cool part, especially because you listened all the way to the end. For our Gestalt Get Together listeners, we actually have a special coupon code to receive $20 off any annual subscription to speechtherapypd.com. Head over there to get ASHA CEUs for listening to this podcast and all other episodes. My code is Gestalt20. You're going to put Gestalt in all caps, and that is GESTALT 20. I hope to see you at our next episode.